So, after reading Chapter 10 on Healthcare Information System Standards, I really learned a lot about how healthcare is standardized and how it's essential to have standardization among healthcare so that we can improve safety, privacy, and healthcare outcomes for our patients and healthcare consumers. So there are two topics I'd like to elaborate on from this chapter, and both topics are under the vocabulary classification of standardization. So the chapter mentions that there's three of them, and those three are vocabulary classification and terminology standards. And so the first topic under the vocabulary category is how CDC standardized clinical vaccines. And so this really stood out to me because as a healthcare provider, you always want to recommend vaccinations for patients. And so in school, we're trained to do the POMR on a patient, also known as a SOAP, or assess the patient and see what problems they have. And so after we assess the patient and write the problem, we also recommend vaccines. And just an example of how we would recommend a vaccine would be as recommended in CDC recommendations, patient is a candidate for receiving PPSV23 vaccine because of comorbidities of COPD or asthma. And so that's just one example of how we would write it or present a patient case when we recommend vaccines. And I never understood why we only used CDC. And after reading this chapter, I realized it's a standardization for vaccines across healthcare, which makes sense because whether you're in a clinic or doctor's office or hospital, you want to use a standardized way of recommending something. And so on page 327, table 10.2, it actually shows a excerpt from the CVX from the CDC website, or an example of the standardizations of the vaccines they give. And this is actually very familiar to me because we actually use this chart and use other charts to see what age group, what patient population, what comorbidities the patient has so that we are able to recommend the vaccine. The second topic I would like to elaborate on is RX norm. And so RX norm is used to standardize generic and brand name drugs among healthcare organizations and pharmacy knowledge-based systems. And this what stood out to me a lot because I realized that each drug has various brand names. So, for example, the antihypertensive medication lisinopril, it has two brand names such as Zestril and Pernivil. And so it would be very complicated if there was no standardization from RX norm because say if one hospital or healthcare organization uses the brand name Zestril and another chain pharmacy used the brand name Privinil, it would, when we exchange information, it would be interpreted wrong or messed up within the system because there's no way to standardize that they're the same drug. And so what RX norm does is that it standardizes that so that there's no confusion and so that there's more convenience while entering electronic information, switching brand and generic names, which is very commonly done in the pharmacy setting. And it could even get more confusing because there are drugs that are combination drugs. The example I gave was with lisinopril, and lisinopril has combinations with hydrochlorothiazide. And so that in itself has other brand names such as Prinzide and Zestoric. And so it gets really confusing in the world of pharmacy and medicine because there's so much medical terminology, so many brand names that can be used. And if there's no standardization, it would get very chaotic. And so looking from a health provider's viewpoint, it's really appreciated that there is standardization, such as CDC and RX norm, for normalizing vaccines and then normalizing the brand and generic drug names, because it's just easier to use among healthcare systems, and it's something that's overlooked a lot because when you're entering something, you don't really think about it. But after reading this chapter, I realized how convenient these standardization systems make healthcare.